All right. Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for coming out. So we are continuing our study in Philippians. We're in Philippians chapter 4, reading verses 2 through 9. And we are on lesson 10 in our book, and that's on page 46. So we started talking about this lesson on Sunday night, and so our goal is to wrap up tonight. So we'll get into more of the commands that Paul gives there in Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 4. Before we begin, I've asked Kurt to lead us in an opening prayer. So Kurt.
God in heaven, we're thankful to be together tonight. We thank you for the freedom that we have to do this, to meet and open your word together and read it. And we thank you for giving us your word in a way that we can understand, and for imparting some of your wisdom and your desire for us through these words. Thank you for being the kind of God that loves his people enough to do this and to give your son Jesus so that we can have salvation. Thank you for the mercy and the grace that we can have because of him. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, thank you, Kurt. So like I said, so for tonight, we're going to finish up lesson 10, continuing in Philippians chapter 4, looking at verses 2 through 9. We're going to focus particularly on verses 4 through 9 in Philippians chapter 4. So we'll wrap that up, and then at the end, we'll spend a couple minutes getting ready for Sunday night. So with that, I have asked Charlie if he could read for us Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 through 9.
I implore Euodia and I implore Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to all men. The Lord is at hand. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. The things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you.
Right. Thank you, Charlie. So if you remember on Sunday night, just as a quick recap where we left off, remember Paul spends the bulk of his letter from about the end of chapter 1 up to the end of chapter 3 talking about this citizenship. And so he's concluded that there in chapter 3, verse 21, and then we've pivoted into chapter 4, and we talked last Sunday night, about this specific example, about the two women that were not in agreement. So we spent a lot of time about the importance of unity and what the situation was, but Paul is making a lot of direct application, specific application for those two women. And then in verses 4 through 7, which is what we just started on Sunday night at the very end of class, Paul gives 6 commands, and I think we started talking about the first 2. So we'll wrap up those commands. And then he also gives not only the commands, but why those commands are important. And so we'll dive into that and then look at what the application is for us tonight as well. And then virtuous thinking and living is verses 8 and 9. And there are really 2 commands that are in there as well. So if you look at verses 4 through 9, there are 6 in total. There are 4 in verses 4 through 7, and then 2 in verses 8 through 9. But that section can also be looked at from thinking about, how are we to think? How are we to make sure that our mind is focused and thinking about and dwelling on and looking at the right things so that we can live godly lives pleasing to God. So that's the brief outline of these, 7, 8 verses here in Philippians chapter 4. So let's dive in. So remember, we started looking at this chart on Sunday night, looking at on the left-hand side, what are these 6 commands? And then what we'll look at tonight as well is why each one of these is important. What does Paul say about each one of these commands, and what is the application for us? So we first started looking at rejoicing always. We talked about what that meant, why that was important, and always meant that no matter what the external circumstances are, we are to always be rejoicing. And then rejoicing in every aspect of our lives, no matter what facet that is. Not just when we're here together assembling, but also, as we're in our workplaces, as we're in our schools, with our friends, whatever capacity, whatever role we're in, we should be rejoicing. And then secondly, we talked about that reasonableness. Let our reasonableness be known. And we talked about how that word there is translated to be genuine or gracious, meaning that we're not going to take advantage of others. And even if we are in the right, even if we have the privilege or the right to take something or to earn something or something is ours, if it's going to harm someone else, if it's going to be to the detriment of someone else, then we defer from that. We defer to the other individual, that we don't want any other individuals to be harmed. And so Paul is saying, let our reasonableness be known so that others can see that. Others can visibly see and observe how we're behaving, that we're behaving with that type of attitude. And again, we talked about how that applied back to verses 2 and 3 with those 2 women, that they, again, were probably arguing about something that was not doctrinal, that it was something that was a matter of opinion. And so they should have the mind of Christ and be deferring and humbling and sacrificing and serving one another. But instead, it seemed like that they were trying to get their own way. Okay, so that's where we left off. And what we talked about again is we look at these 6 commands. These are some hard commands, but they are very direct and they're very necessary. That's why we'll spend some time looking at these. So then the third one on the list is, he says, do not be anxious. So when you think of being anxious, what do you think about? What kind of thoughts or emotions come to mind? What does that mean to be anxious? Worried, okay. What else? Scared. Stressed, okay. Anxiety is a real issue, isn't it? Right? There are a lot of people, whether it's you personally or someone you love, I'm sure all of us can know and think about somebody who is impacted by anxiety. So the idea of being nervous, uncomfortable, anxious about things. So in this specific context, is Paul just talking about, hey, don't be nervous at all? Because if it's don't be nervous at all, I'm always nervous, when I get up to speak. I took a trip, went back to my alma mater, and I spoke last night at Indiana University, where I graduated, did my undergrad, and I talked about my work. And so it's something I know, and I get up and I'm nervous. I'm like, why are you nervous? Why are you anxious about this? So is Paul talking about that type of anxiety? Is he talking about that type of nervousness? Tom, it seemed like you were shaking your head no. Charlie's coming with a mic if you have something to say other than no.
No, the answer is no. That's not what he's talking about. It's not to worry about things that you have no control over. I mean, God is in control.
Yep.
I mean, he's not saying not to be scared or anxious about the circumstances that we're in, but not to just dwell on it. You've got to think beyond that and know that the Lord loves us and he's going to see us through it.
Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts? Ryan? Charlie, Ryan has his hand up down here.
I think with anxiousness, I really liked what Tom said, and I also think that depending on what you're doing, there's always going to be a little bit of nerves, you know. So like getting up and speaking in front of people, you know, if that's not something you've practiced a lot, or maybe it's just kind of how, you know, I know when I've come up here before and given like talks, you know, you just get a little nerves. You don't want to mess up. So I think sometimes it's almost normal to be a little nervous, a little anxious, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that's just a natural thing.
Yeah. Because we are human, right? Arlene?
I think we need to, when we're studying this, we need to think about their times. We're always going to have things that we've not done before, that we're a little uncomfortable with. Anytime we step out of our comfort zone, we're going to be anxious, and we can work through that. But the context, I think, is these people were in fear for their lives. They were being persecuted, real life persecution. They had families that had been taken away and put to death because they were Christians. And so I think the context is that don't be anxious for what's going to happen to you. I'm always amazed at how persecuted they were, how absolutely terrifying. They all had personal stories, but that the church grew abundantly during those times of persecution. And so I think that's what he's talking about. Don't be anxious. The Lord's got this. And we think about people that have been really seriously persecuted like that. For them, to die is gain, to take them away from this misery. So I think that's the comfort that he's talking about, that the Lord's got this. He's going to take care of you. Your reward will be there.
Yep, absolutely. Because we're going to talk about this here in just a minute, because right next to it there, right, the next command after that is, let your requests be made known to God, right? Let your prayers, your supplications be made known to God with thanksgiving, right? And then we're going to talk on the other side, the importance of this, about it. He says there, the Lord is at hand, and we'll talk about what that is. But to your point, in their context, that, you know, they could be thinking about, or they could be worrying about, you know, where their next meal is going to come from, how they're going to be provided for, or are they going to be persecuted, right? So in looking at this, it seems to be that, again, the context is this idea of thinking self-centeredly, you know, being selfish, thinking about myself, what am I going to do, how am I going to take care of myself, whether it's the material things around me or those persecutions that are going to happen. And he's saying, don't worry about that, right? And almost if you link these two together, he's almost saying, don't pray or don't worry about anything, but pray about everything, right? Because you need to let that, you need to take that to God. You need to put that at God's feet. So again, I don't think it's this idea about being anxious just about anything, you know, just general nerves, right? Being uncomfortable. I think it's more about the specific context here about them being taken care of, them being provided for. Because we're going to see, again, when we get to that right-hand side of the chart, about why that's so important, that God is going to be there providing for them. And then, I don't think Scott's here tonight, but Scott made the comment, Scott Hartzell, Sunday night, where he said, you know, whatever the storm is, you know, there are many times that we have storms in our lives. Sometimes God calms the storm, and sometimes God calms us, right? That he gives us the peace. But regardless of what happens in that scenario, God is the one that's in control. And that's why we don't need to be anxious, right? That's why we don't need to be worried about it. Kyle?
Yeah, I'm typically an anxious type of person, so for me, I've had to learn a lot of trial and error with that. But in all aspects, like any feeling you have, like any sad or worry or anxious or fear, like it's what your reaction to it is, you know, that's what makes or breaks it. Like when you, like you said, like when you pray about it, knowing that you're anxious, that's what matters. It's not the fact that you're anxious, it's what you do during those times.
Yeah, yeah. Turn it over to God, absolutely. Dave, did you have your hand up?
Anxiety in its worst form can be paralyzing, and it actually prevents us from doing anything else. We're not doing anything good because we're so anxious about whatever it is going on in our lives, it prevents us from really fulfilling our role as Christians. And that's at its extreme. And I think there's a difference between that kind of anxiousness and just worry or nervousness. But when it really begins to take over your entire thought process, it is paralyzing.
Yeah. It can be debilitating, right? Where you can't do anything, right? You're paralyzed. Absolutely.
I may have a little bit of a different thought on this. I do appreciate Arlene bringing up the just the seriousness of the situation, because that's where we see Jesus in the garden, right? I mean, if there's any situation to be anxious about, it's about when you're about to be crucified, and we see him, taking his request to God and praying about those things. And so we even see an example in Jesus of how to do that. You look at the Psalms and you see David and others that are, in these difficult situations where people are chasing them or they're going through wars or, horrible times, and you see them letting those requests be made known to God. And a lot in the Psalms you'll see, thankfulness as well, that they always go back to God. And I guess the difference in my thinking is that, like, anxiety, whether it's on a very low level or, where it's disrupting your life or, your life is being threatened. I mean, God gives us situations now to practice this. So when we have, anxiety, a lot of us have anxiety getting up and standing in front of 400 people. That's not an easy thing to do. So what do you do about that? I mean, the anxiety comes from, at least from my understanding or my opinion, is a lack of confidence, fear that something's going to happen, fear that we're going to make a mistake, fear that somebody's going to, think poorly of us. And when we bring those requests to God, when we pray about things, when we listen to the truth that he loves us, that he cares about us, there's that peace that passes understanding that Paul talks about, because it doesn't matter, because we have a Father that loves us, that takes care of us, that no matter what happens when we get up there on the podium and we, mess up, like, it's not going to matter because we're full of a room full of people who are going to love us and support us anyway.
Yep. Great point. Great comment. Any other thoughts, comments on that? So then if we couple that again, going back to the request being made known to God. So if we're in these situations, he says, again, don't worry about anything, pray about everything. And so when you're making your request made known to God, why do you think Paul uses this term around request? And I'm thinking about the difference between a request versus like a demand or an entitlement. Is there any significance into what and how Paul is laying this out? Again, to Arlene's point, these could have been very difficult situations given the circumstances that were around the Philippians and the environment out of which that they became Christians, right? That they were, again, Paul using all of these military terms in this letter, talking about the battle, talking about standing firm, talking about not leaving their post. And so what was surrounding them, they could have been saying, hey, God, I turn my life over to you. Now I need you to do your part, right? But he uses this term request. What's the significance of that? Janice? Oh, someone else has yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had a comment for your previous question, the discussion about anxiety. I agree with Charlie that this is talking about more than just butterflies in your stomach. This is people who, they were at risk and they were in danger of becoming consumed with the physical problems that surrounded them. And in this and the passage that's referred to in the questions, Matthew 6, with the Sermon on the Mount, I think the point behind it is God is saying, do not be anxious. And he repeats it 3 times in Matthew. And again here. But another translation for that could be trust me. And Jesus is saying, trust me because I clothe the flowers of the field. Trust me because I take care of the birds of the air. And it makes me think of like teaching a kid to swim. You want them to jump off the edge of the pool, and you tell them, trust me, but they stand there frozen because they don't know that you're going to catch them. And God is telling these people, trust me, keep persevering, keep the faith,
Yep.
because I will catch you.
Yep.
And I think that's the kind of anxiety, more than just small daily cares and worries that we think about with our rich American life. These were big problems.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Great point. Janice, was your comment related? Okay. Okay. It doesn't matter either way.
But a request is, it's saying by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known. We are coming, we're so grateful to him and thankful to him for his faithfulness always, that trust that she was talking about. And so we can make our request, like, this is painful and it hurts, and I would really like this to stop. And I trust you that if this pain can't stop right now, that you're using it for good, right? One of the verses that my mind keeps going to in this discussion is Hebrews 2. Verse 15 says that it's talking about that Jesus had death in verse 14 so that he could overcome death, so that he might deliver those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. So when we're caught in these cycles of anxiety and we're not turning it over to God, we are not going to make good decisions. We're going to be a slave to the emotions and to anybody else who comes along and says, I can fix it.
Yep. Yep. And I'm glad that you called out Hebrews, because we're going to, if we get to our questions tonight, in Hebrews 11, that great chapter of faith, right? Where he encourages us to maintain our faith and to be faithful because of all the examples of those that had faith before us. Those that all maintained their faith, was it all a rosy outcome? Was it all? No, he says some died by the sword, some died by fire, but because of the faith, because of the trust, because you put it in God's hands, he's the one that takes care of that, right? Arlene? Charlie, can we get a microphone to Arlene?
No, what I was thinking, just along with what everybody's saying here, is we may not have the outcome we desire, but in verse 7, it talks about, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding. That's what was so incredible. That's part of the explosive growth of the church, that these people knew that they were sentenced to death, they were going to be tortured, whatever happened, they had personal knowledge of these things. And they were very peaceful because they trusted that God was going to take care of it. And so that's what we're asking for. It's not necessarily that this is all going to be rosy and it's going to be successful and I'm not going to hurt and all that. It's the acceptance that whatever God brings, he'll take care of it and I'm good. And it's that peace that passes understanding. That really takes care of so much anxiety.
Yep. And to your point, we'll talk about this a little bit further, but it's peace beyond our comprehension, right? That we can't even put a value on it. We can't even fully understand it. Absolutely. Okay, just looking at the time, I'm going to keep us going. The last two commands that are there, he says, think or dwell on these. So when he says there in verse 8 to think on these things or dwell on these things, what are these things? What is this? What are they to think on? What are they to dwell on? It's that whole list, right? So Paul, he gives them, again, I think back to Arlene's point, all this negativity that could have been around them, all this suffering, whatever. Again, we talked back in chapter 3, there could have been 3 different groups that were enemies of the cross, right? It could have been the Judaizing teachers, it could have been those that were faithful that had fallen away, or it could have been the pagans. Could have been one of those 3, could have been all of those 3. But regardless, all of that negativity that was around them, all of that opposition that was against them, that was trying to take away their joy, that was trying to stop them from rejoicing, Paul says, this is what I want you to focus on. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later if we have time, but he's trying to say, all right, stop doing this and now fill your mind with this. Focus on this. And again, going back to the mind, this idea of why the mind and what we focus on is so important, because focusing on the positive, that will put us in the right direction. So his command is, think on these things. And so if I'm to think on these things, then that means those are the types of things that I need to be putting in my mind, not the other types of things, that I need to be filling my mind with good things, okay? And so then the last thing, the last command is, he says, practice these. So when he says practice these or practice these things, and that's in verse 9, what is it that they're to practice? What are those things that, what is he telling them there to practice? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So I think it was, if I can remember, I think it was 4 things. What they've seen, heard, what was revealed, and then there's a 4th one. But he says there in verse 4, what all encompassing, everything you've heard me say, do, teach, behave, everything about that, practice this, do this. And this word for practice, it's not just, okay, you practice it once. Like when I was playing saxophone, my dad played jazz, and so I thought that was really cool, so I want to play the saxophone. But when I practiced, I just practiced for like one time. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go on to the next thing, because I got bored with it. It wasn't my thing. But what he's saying here with practice is you continually do it. You don't do it once, but you make it a part of your life. You're constantly doing it. And so it's not just this practice to say, okay, I'm good at that now I move on and I do something else. It is continual. It is a part of who you are, okay? So these are the 6 commands that he gives. And then as you read this here in these verses 4 through 9, it seems that he tells them why this is so important. So let's read verses 4 through 9 again and think about this in mind. So he says, here's the command, here's why it's so important. So starting in verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be made known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. So that's what I'm talking about. The reasonableness, let that be known because the Lord is at hand. And then verse 6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. So again, verse 4, he tells them to rejoice always, and again, I tell you to rejoice. So rejoicing is so important. He says, it's important because it's important. Rejoice. That's what you need to be doing. And then in verse 5, your reasonableness needs to be made known because the Lord is at hand. Verse 6 is, do not be anxious and let your requests be made known to God. So that's coupled together because in verse 7, the peace of God, as Arlene was saying, will be given to you, which will guard your heart and mind, which we'll talk about what that means. So then in verse 8, think on these things. In verse 9, learn to do them. Verse 9, practice these things. Verse 9, the God of peace will be with you. Okay, so let's break each one of these down here in a couple minutes. So on the right-hand side, starting at the top, rejoice. So again, that idea of being thankful, being grateful, that's what we need to have because he has provided us peace and comfort. So now, this idea of Lord at hand. So in reading and looking at this could probably mean one of 2 things. The Lord at hand could mean that the day of judgment is coming. The God and Christ could come back at any time. But I'm not sure that fits within what the context is based off our discussion, what we just talked about, why they were not to be anxious, right? probably means that he's saying, let your reasonableness be known, don't be anxious, all that, because God is right there with you, right? So in our weekly Bible reading and in text talk, we're in Psalm 118, right? So let's turn to Psalm 118. I think it's very appropriate and applicable to what we're talking about here tonight. Just based off time, we're not going to have time to read all of Psalm 118. I wanted to, but we're just not going to have time. Can someone read verses 5 through 7 of Psalm 118? Who wants to read that? Psalm 118, verses 5 through 7. Can we get a microphone down here, Charlie? Thank you. He's coming.
I called on the Lord in distress. The Lord answered me and set me in a broad place. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? The Lord is for me among those who help me. Therefore I shall see my desire on those who hate me.
Okay, thank you. So I think Edwin and Andrew talked about that in yesterday or today's text talk, this idea of God is my helper, that the Lord is at hand. So he's telling them here, you need to behave this way because God is right there by your side. He's there. He will help you. You call out to him in distress. You call out to him for help, and he will help you. He's right there for you. So the Lord is at hand. Okay. Then the peace of God, we see there in verse 7. So God is the source of our peace. He is the calm assurance that he provides to us with the right relationship that we have with him. And again, as we talked about, that the peace of God is more than we can comprehend. It's more than what human understanding has. Okay, so let's look a couple minutes on the fourth one here. Guard your heart and mind. So this word guard here is another military term that Paul is using. So the term there is to set up a garrison, meaning to bring in troops to help protect and provide. So today, sometimes when we think of the term garrison, we can think of it in terms of troops that are there to protect or a military facility. But the point is, with this word guard, if we want to have our heart guarded and our mind guarded, what's he say on the left-hand side? That we're not to be anxious and we need our requests be made known unto God. And then that's what will provide the protection. So the irony in all of this is the protection is not physical. The protection is not a troop. It's not a military. It's not a military installation. It's not everything that those Philippians would have been familiar with in the physical world, but it was actually God's peace. The peace of God is coming to them, providing protection for them, guarding them. And that's how they get peace. And I think, Arlene, that's kind of what you were alluding to or talking about, right? That if you want the peace of God, you need to pray to God and you need to be obedient. You need to pray to God and ask him for it. You need to pray to God and let your request be made known unto him. And then you need to be following his commandments. You need to be doing these things. You need to be living this way. And that is what protects and provides. And that's the idea of guarding the heart and the mind. Okay? Yeah, Tom?
I was just going to say that part of thinking about guarding is the fact that we have an adversary. And so we need to be conscious of the fact that there's someone wanting to rob us of that peace and that joy. And so we need to become like Christ and emulate him as Paul did, but to guard and protect our feelings, our convictions, stand fast in them, and just not take them for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. That Satan is looking to attack, that he's after it, and that we have to be cognizant of that. Yep, that's a great point. And again, we'll talk about this in just a little bit when we answer one of our questions. But again, the idea of the heart and mind, this is a common theme in all of Philippians, right? Just how many times we've talked about it in the last week or two, about the idea of the mind. And so again, we have to treat the mind and the heart very precious and want that protection. that we need that protection just because of what Tom talked about. So then again, in verse 9, he says to learn these. So if you look at those last four, you kind of follow the bouncing ball, if you will. Start on the left-hand side, second to last one. You need to think or dwell on these things, and by thinking or dwelling on them, then you learn them. It's important to learn them so that you understand what the importance of them are. And then you come over back to the left-hand side, then you need to practice it. You need to put it into practice. You need to be doing it, just like what we talked about, continuously implementing them. And then ultimately on the right-hand side, then the God of peace will be with you. That you follow those steps, and then the God of peace will be with you. And again, if you look on the right-hand side, the third one down, he says the peace of God, and then the last one, he says the God of peace. So he just inverts it. But the point is, God's peace can be provided to you. And this is how he's given us the formula. So as there are people that are out there that are struggling with sin and are looking for peace, that they don't have peace, this is how Paul tells us that we can get it. Okay? Any questions, comments, thoughts as you digest this, think about this? Yeah, down here in the front.
I think it's this part of the chapter is always interesting because you really are reminded it's a letter, it's a personal letter, and you're getting to the end of it, and it's kind of that these are the last things I want them to remember. These are the last things you're going to read from this. This is what I want you to carry with you, and that always comes out to me where he's almost like, what else can I just encourage you? What else can I leave you with? Because he's not with them, and the idea of but God's there with you, and I'm not. But this, and so that always comes back to me in the epistles, the last part of each of them. I think it's so interesting. It kind of reminds us, because I think it's easy to forget sometimes we're in the middle of it. But it is. He's writing a personal letter, and it's the idea of, these are the last couple of things, almost, the most important things, if you will, in the book, that if you don't remember anything else, when you're finished reading my letter, this is what I want you to walk away with. And that, I think these verses really kind of bring that back, of the idea of, if you get nothing else, here's the main idea. Here's what I want you to remember when I can't be there to teach you and to grow with you.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Any other thoughts, comments? Okay, so we've got about 7 minutes left, so let's go through some of our questions. So the first question for us is, how are the commands Paul gives connected to having the right mind? So again, this idea that we've been talking about the last couple weeks of the importance of the mind and putting our mind in the right place and getting our mind right. How are these commands, these 6 commands that he's just given, how is that connected to having the right mind? What's the connection there?
Having a proper attitude.
Proper attitude, okay. And what do you mean by that, Harley?
Well, you can make a decision whether you're going to be happy or not. And he's telling you to think about things that are positive, true, and noble, and so forth. And if you keep some of the things that he's commanded in mind, then you should be on the right path. If it's when you stray off to that path and get distracted by something, which is obviously the devil doing his work, then there's no joy for you. Any people that have anxiety or depression or anything else, they're not very, very happy people, obviously, because they're going through some type of turmoil. If they could, find joy in their life or turn things around upstairs in their mind, then that would make them a little bit better and brighter person, probably. A little bit brighter outlook for them.
It's something you said there, Harley. It's a decision. It's a choice. It's a choice on how you behave in all six of those. Janice?
I think we can see, if we contrast it to what we see in Galatians 5:19 through 21, where he's talking about the works of the flesh, and he says at the end of that, and those who practice such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. So you can do the works of the flesh, or you can think on these things, you can learn from me, you can do these things, practice these things, and you'll have the peace of God.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Arlene?
I was going to say, we've been talking about the military, and we're preparing constantly. We don't want to be caught off guard. And so that exercising, that practicing, this is everlasting. And soldiers would get that they're constantly prepared for war, in the hope that they don't have it, but again, you're constantly preparing and exercising, buffeting your body to be prepared for these events. And if you're caught unawares, shame on you.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, just to that point, I think, Jeannie, it was something that you had said, maybe it was last week when we were talking about this, that if we don't have our mind right, and if you go back to, see if I can figure out how to go back. If you look at the left-hand side, if you don't choose to follow all of those things, then you're not going to get everything on the right-hand side, right? Which ultimately ends with the God of peace. So if we're not, again, last week we were talking about the importance of having the right mind, because then that ultimately ends in having that glorified body. Here we have to have the right mind because it's going to end in getting the God of peace, right? And so that's why that mind is so important. Okay, one more question and then we'll draw to a close. What can anxiety lead to, and what can we do to protect against being anxious? So if we're anxious and we don't turn it over to God and we don't follow the command that Paul gives here, what can anxiety lead to? What's the end of anxiety? Ryan?
So this brings to mind when Saul had just been anointed king before David, and they were about to go, I think it was fight against the Philistines, and he had to wait for Samuel. Samuel said, I'll be here in 7 days. Samuel the prophet, who had already, at that time in the story with Saul, prophesied, it was 3 to 4, maybe 5 things, accurately, that you just can't happen chance know. He said, 7 days I'll be here. Wait for me to sacrifice this offering. And instead of kind of waiting for him, Saul started looking out at his men who had been waiting the 7 days too, looking at the Philistines, running away and getting afraid. And instead of trusting in God, trusting in Samuel, who got his power from God, he went and offered that sacrifice. And as he was doing it, Samuel walked up that hill. And the first thing Samuel said was, I think it was something along the lines of, how foolish. And he said right then and there, you've lost the kingdom. God's going to put someone else in that path. So what can anxiety lead to? It can lead to you trying to take a situation in your own hands and not trusting God to do it, to do it for you. Yeah. Obviously, we have our own responsibilities, but there is a time when it's all right, God, you'll do what you do. I'll do my end of the bargain. What can we do to protect against being anxious? I think what helps for me is sometimes with being anxious, it's because I haven't done the right things. So making sure that by the grace of God, I do everything I can to protect against situations that would make me anxious. When I'm now placed in a situation where I can't protect against being anxious, like a future event, or maybe, coming up in front of people and speaking, it's just going to happen, I think that's the time when we have to accept maybe the situation we're in and trust the good Lord to see us out of it.
Yeah. So back to what we talked about, right? Turning it over to God and praying to Him. Tom?
I was reminded, I think, of something David said a little while ago about it'll paralyze you.
Yeah.
You won't be able to function in any way and would be pleasing to the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely.
So self-absorbed.
Yeah, exactly. Self-centered. Yeah, absolutely. I'll leave this question with a quote. You may have see if you recognize this. A famous person said this: "Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering." right? So if you're familiar with Star Wars, Yoda said that, right? So fear, anxiety. So fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. So what Ryan was saying, it's disobedience, right? Anxiety leads to disobedience.